So, as I mentioned, we're sitting in this resource room of a site of struggle, American Art Against Anti-Black Violence. This is an exhibition that was organized by the Block Museum of Art at Northwestern University, but we partnered with them because we thought this was really important to show here in Montgomery, which is both at once the birthplace of the Confederacy and also the birthplace of the Civil Rights Movement. And it's kind of those two sides of the coin that what the city is and how it is continuing to grow as we look back at our history. And this exhibition really looks historically at anti-Black violence through the lens of art and artists' interpretations of that. And when we came across the book that Dr. Elliott Currie wrote, A Peculiar Indifference, The Neglected Toll of Violence on Black America, we just thought this was a perfect tie-in to not only, expand upon what artists are looking at, but really look at what's happening in our world. And he does a wonderful job of doing that. So the format of today's program is I'm going to provide a short introduction. Then Dr. Currie is going to talk about why he wrote this book and what he was interested in and some of his findings. And then we will open this up to your questions. So you can either jump in at that point when I open the floor or use a chat, whichever is more comfortable for you. And we'll have a guided discussion. So good morning to you all. Dr. Elliott Currie is professor of criminology, law, and society at the University of California, Irvine, and adjunct professor in the Faculty of Law, School of Justice, Queensland University of Technology in Australia. Dr. Currie is a graduate of Roosevelt University in Chicago and received his PhD in sociology from the University of California, Berkeley. He's the author of a number of publications on crime, delinquency, drug abuse, and social policy, including Confronting Crime, An American Challenge, Dope and Trouble, Portraits of Delinquent Youth, Reckoning, Drugs, the Cities and the American Future, The Road to Whatever, Middle Class Culture and the Crisis of Adolescence, and The Roots of Danger, Violent Crime and Global Perspectives. He is a co-author of Whitewashing Race, The Myth of a Colorblind Society, which was the winner of a 2004 book award from the Benjamin L. Hooks Institute for Social Change and a finalist for the C. Wright Mills Award of the Society of Study of Social Problems. And his book, Crime and Punishment in America, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize General Nonfiction in 1999. Today, we'll be discussing, as I mentioned, his most recent book, A Peculiar Indifference, The Neglected Toll of Violence on Black America, which explores the sources of the enduring racial disparities in violent death and injury in America and outlines strategies to reduce them. It was named a New York Times Notable Book of 2020. In addition to his writing and teaching, Dr. Currie is the recipient of both the August Vollmer Award and the Mentor Award from the American Society of Criminology, and has been a consultant to many organizations concerned with crime prevention, social policy, and the enhancement of juvenile and criminal justice, both in the United States and abroad, including the National Council on Crime and Delinquency, the National Advisory Council on Economic Opportunity, the California Governor's Task Force on Civil Rights, and the Home Office of Great Britain. So welcome, Dr. Currie.
Thank you. Thanks, Jennifer, very much. And thanks to all of you guys for coming. It's been almost 2 years since this book was published. And I'd like to start today, as Jennifer suggested, by talking a little bit about why I wanted to write it in the first place, and also say something about what's happened since the book has come out, because things have changed. So I wrote this book originally because it seemed to me to be a terrible, terrible injustice that as a society, we were tolerating, mostly accepting as a sort of natural fact of life, one of the most fundamental inequalities imaginable. A sharp, sharp disparity, a radical disparity in the very chance of survival, the chances of living or dying. I've been studying American violence for a long time. That's my job. And it continued to surprise me and to shock me that we seem so complacent about the level of violence that we routinely suffer in the United States, and also the degree to which that violence is shaped by race. We seem to accept these things despite the fact that no other advanced industrial society on the planet comes even remotely close to the level of violence that we routinely accept as a natural part of the American landscape or its racial dimensions. There's simply nothing like it in the rest of the advanced industrial world. So instead, we, and by we, I mean the people who are outside the most affected communities who actually do have the collective power to do something about these disparities, we, for the most part, have responded with what I call a peculiar indifference. And I took that title from the great scholar and activist W.E.B. Du Bois. It comes from his classic study, which was called The Philadelphia Negro, which he wrote just at the end of the 19th century. And he was writing about the mostly unaddressed health problems of Black communities in Philadelphia and in the country as a whole. And looking at those disparities way back then, he said, there have been few other cases in the history of civilized people where human suffering has been viewed with such peculiar indifference. And he wrote those words in 1899, and over 120 years later, I think we are still peculiarly indifferent to those sufferings. So my book was designed to shake that indifference. I wanted to explore what I think we know about the dimensions and the human impact and the causes of this enduring emergency. And at the end, I wanted to make some arguments about what we could do about it. And when I published this book 2 years ago, I painted a pretty dire picture of the situation then. And I'm sorry to say that the picture has gotten worse, considerably worse, since I published the book. If you've read the book, and if you have, thank you very much, you'll remember that I started with an account of a particularly tragic weekend that took place in the summer of 2018 in my hometown of Chicago. I happened to be back there at the time. Over the course of this single weekend, at least 71 people were shot in the city of Chicago. 12 of them died. And I focused on that weekend in the book because it highlighted in microcosm something about the depth of racial inequalities and violent death and injury in the United States. All but one of the 12 people who died by homicide over that weekend were African American. Nearly all of them came from a handful of neighborhoods in the city where violence had been a terrible presence for just about as long as anybody could remember. And that was just one weekend. Over the course of that year, 2018, there were 561 homicides in Chicago, again, mostly cruelly concentrated in some of the city's poorest Black neighborhoods. But here's the really bad news. That was 2018. 2 years later, in 2020, there were 769 homicides in the city of Chicago. It was an increase of about 37% over 2018. It was the second highest number of violent deaths that the city had ever suffered in its entire history. And as always, this was not an equal opportunity disaster. Of the Chicago killings over the year that ended at the end of January 2021, the race of the victim of those homicides was recorded for 681 of those homicides, okay? Of those 681 who died, 561 were Black, 68 were Latino, 49 were white, and 3 were Asian. In the city as a whole, on the other hand, just under a third of the population is Black, roughly the same proportion as white and non-Hispanic, roughly another third is Latino, 6% is Asian. So African Americans were less than a third of Chicago's population, but more than 4 out of 5 of its homicide victims. Non-Hispanic whites, who are also roughly a third of the city's population, were just 7% of its homicide victims. So, the violence in Chicago that year, and for that matter in every year since, got a lot of attention from the media, not for the first time. And there was a lot of speculation about what it was about Chicago in particular that explained it. And I can't tell you how often people asked me, since I'm from there, right, in this sort of accusing way, what was wrong with the city, as if it were somehow kind of my fault. But the truth is actually much worse. Not only is my city of Chicago nowhere near to being the most violent city in the United States, it's also just one of many, many American cities that saw homicide rise, often very dramatically, during 2020, and then many of them through 2021 and into this year, 2022. So in my book, I threw a lot of numbers at the reader. Some people thought probably I threw too many numbers at the reader, because I thought that those numbers were just flat out shocking and that people needed to know about them. Most of those numbers so came from 2018, sometimes from before that. And no matter how troubling those numbers may have seemed at the time, the newer ones that we have are a lot more troubling. Let me share some of those newer numbers with you, and I'll try not to bombard you with too many of them, but I think they're important because they tell us something very, very important about race and violence in America. The most recent and reliable figures on violent death in the United States come from the Federal Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. They cover the year 2020. The numbers, like all numbers, are kind of cold and just numbers, but they give us a picture of the racial disparities in American violence that I think should shake us to our core. Now, you can measure racial disparities in violent death in a lot of different ways. Probably the simplest is to look at different rates at which people of different races die by violence. And again, these statistics are ones that we have, and we've collected them for a long time. We collect them every year. These are usually presented in our public health statistics as the number of people who die of homicide per 100,000 population, okay? In the United States as a whole, in 2018, the rate of homicide death was just under 6 per 100,000. By 2020, it had jumped to a little under 8 per 100,000. It's a rise of almost 30%. And it's important to understand that that rise was absolutely unprecedented. There hasn't been a rise in a single couple of years like that that anybody can remember since we've been collecting these statistics. In itself, that's alarming enough. But that overall national rate, of course, is an average that hides the deepening racial divide in violence. In 2018, Black Americans died by violence at a rate of just over 20 per 100,000, white non-Hispanic Americans at less than 3 per 100,000. So the Black homicide death rate, in other words, in 2018 was already roughly 7 times the white rate back then. By 2020, the Black homicide death rate had risen to 28 per 100,000, and it was now close to 9 times the white rate. And that's because even though the white death rate from violence actually increased during those years as well, the Black rate rose faster. That's bad enough, but it doesn't tell you the whole story. For young Black men, who represent the group at highest risk of death by violence in the United States, the Black-white ratio was 15-1 in 2018, and it grew to almost 19-1 by 2020. Again, an extraordinary, unprecedented rise over the course of just a couple of years. Now let's pause to think about that number for just a minute. This means that as of our most recent statistics, a Black youth in his late teens through his 20s is nearly 19 times as likely as his white counterpart to die by deliberate violence in this country. Not twice as likely, not 5 times as likely, 19 times as likely. But in a way, these disparities too, huge as they are, actually understate the magnitude of the risk of violent death that's faced by many Black Americans. And that's because the risk for white people in America is itself actually very high by comparison with every other country in the advanced industrial world, which is something we don't think about very much. But when we compare American Black men to American white men, in other words, we're comparing them to people whose risks of violent death are themselves unusually high in the advanced industrial world, several times higher than the chances of, say, German or English men dying by violence, close to 20 times as likely as the chance of a Japanese man dying by violence. And that's the white non-Hispanic rate. And these figures tend to minimize the Black risk of violent death in another way too. And that's because it's the ones I've been giving you so far are averages for Black Americans as a whole, but violence, like most other social ills, is not distributed evenly across the United States. For example, as many of you probably know, the state of Alabama has tragically outpaced for a long time the national average when it comes to violence. I mentioned that in 2020, the overall homicide death rate among Black Americans had risen to 28 per 100,000. Here in Alabama, I say here in Alabama, of course, I'm not in Alabama, but you are. Here in Alabama, it was 35 per 100,000. In that year, 2020, the national violent death rate for young Black men was an astounding 124 per 100,000, which is off the charts for the rest of the world. But here in Alabama, it was 177 per 100,000, almost 43% higher than the national rate. That's a big difference. And keep in mind, again, to put this into context, there is no country on the planet that suffers a homicide death rate even close to that 177 per 100,000 population. Some places in Alabama, as you may know, have been especially hard hit over the last couple of years during the pandemic. Mobile had the highest, last year, had the highest number of homicides reported in its recorded history. Birmingham came close, didn't quite match its highest rate, but came very, very close to it. But so these are rates of homicide. There's actually an even more revealing and I think more meaningful way to look at the magnitude and the human meaning of these, abstract kind of technical numbers about the racial disparities in violence. And that's to look at them through the lens of what public health researchers call YPLL, which stands for Years of Potential Life Lost. It's an issue that I talk about in my book a lot. Some of you may know this measure. The way it works is you pick a cutoff point, an age. For conventional reasons, it's usually age 65. You pick that as an end point. And then you calculate how many years of life before that age are lost because of various kinds of illnesses or injuries. And some causes of death typically translate into greater numbers of years of life lost than others. So heart disease, for example, is the leading killer of people overall in the United States and has been for a long time. It's the leading cause of death. More people die of heart disease than anything in this country. But because heart disease tends to kill people at relatively later ages, each death from heart disease doesn't add so many years of potential life lost. If I die at age 63 of a heart attack, then if we're using age 65 as our endpoint, I've lost 2 years of potential life, right? If I die in a car accident at age 15, I've lost 50 years of potential life, okay? So the result is that even though more people die of heart disease than anything else in America, the biggest source of YPLL, years of potential life lost in the United States, is actually what's called unintentional injuries, which includes car accidents. It also includes drug overdoses, which of course have skyrocketed also in recent years. And that's because each one of these deaths tends to take place at a younger age and therefore adds more to the total lost years, right? Now, this becomes very, very important in understanding the human toll of violence because just like unintentional injuries, intentional injuries, violence, most often kill people at a relatively young age, often at a tragically young age, right? So in 2018, for example, the person with the highest probability of dying by violence in America was a 23-year-old Black man. Every time a young man that age dies, it takes away 42 years of potential life if we're using this measure. So YPLL is measuring not just how many people die of a given cause, but how premature those deaths were. In a sense, it's a measure of how much potential future is being destroyed, future for an individual, future for an entire community. And the thing is that in the United States, that measure is heavily, heavily shaped by race. So in the country as a whole, for all races combined, for all Americans, homicide in 2020 was the 5th leading cause of lost years of life. That's already very startlingly high. It's important to be clear that this average number itself is very, very unusual in the advanced industrial world. It's generally only in some poorer countries of the global south that homicide even appears at all on the list of the biggest causes of lost years of life. But of course, predictably, the picture gets much more troubling when we break this number down by race. For Black Americans overall, homicide is the number 2 cause of lost years of life. It's 5 for the population as a whole. It's number 2 for Black Americans. And for Black men, it's worse. Violence takes more years of life from Black men in America than heart disease, stroke, and diabetes combined. I'll say that again, because every time I say it, it surprises me. And I've been looking at that figure for a very long time. Violence takes more years of life from Black men in America than heart disease, stroke, and diabetes combined. And this huge racial difference profoundly shapes the overall picture of how people die between the races in the United States. Again, these numbers can sound terribly abstract, like all mere numbers, but they translate into real lives that are lived or not lived. It means that more whites, far more whites, live to be old enough to die of the diseases of older age, right? Like heart disease. That they have far more years to be somebody's son or daughter, somebody's parent, somebody's sister, somebody's friend, right? There's a poem by the great Chicago poet Gwendolyn Brooks that captures this fundamental aspect of racial inequality in a very eloquent way. You may know this poem. It's called Beverly Hills, Chicago. It describes the feelings of a Black family of modest income as they drive through what's one of the most affluent white neighborhoods on the south side of the city of Chicago. She describes in the poem how beautiful the city looks. She says that even the garbage looks nice. She acknowledges that even these affluent white people have troubles and that, like everyone else, they're going to die at some point. But she writes, nobody is saying that these people do not ultimately cease to be. And sometimes their passings are even more painful than ours. It is just that so often they live till their hair is white. They live till their hair is white. Well, there are lots of reasons why white Americans more often live till their hair is white, and their relative freedom from violence is one of those reasons. So I could spin out more numbers all morning, but I promise I won't. My point is that I think these numbers should shock us into action, because what they describe is a truly profound and terribly destructive kind of inequality that I believe represents a fundamental violation of the most basic principles of social justice. In fact, I think it's not too much to say that it violates fundamental human rights. And that's especially true because it's a preventable inequality. There's really no mystery about where this problem comes from, where this disparity comes from. At least since Du Bois studied this problem back at the end of the 19th century, we've understood that racial disparity in violent death isn't accidental. It's rooted in processes that we understand, processes of racialized social exclusion, stifled opportunity, whose specific forms have changed somewhat over our history as a country, but whose basic impact has changed really very little. We have more than a century of careful research, which I talk about a good deal of it in my book. And that research keeps confirming over and over again that a toxic mix, a mix of harsh economic inequality, extreme poverty, limited opportunities for meaningful work, and these special obstacles and special frustrations that segregation itself throws up, thoroughly explains the racial violence divide. There are some differences of emphasis, slight differences of opinion within this research for sure, but there's no serious disagreement on the basics among people who study these issues. We know what this is. We know what this is. We know what it's about. And we've known for a long, long time. And that's what's so frustrating to me personally. I was taught about these realities when I was in graduate school. I won't say exactly when I was, but let's just suffice it to say that it was long, long before my own hair started to turn white. But there was no serious disagreement about the causes of this problem back then. There is none today. And because we know what it's about, we also know what it'd take to fix it. The problem isn't a lack of knowledge. In other words, it is the absence of action. So I say a lot in the book about the details of what I think we might most effectively do to turn this problem around. But let me for now just point to a couple of things that I think are especially crucial. And I hope we can talk a little bit more about strategies for change more deeply in a minute. I think that the most basic principle is that we need finally to take this issue with the seriousness that it deserves, which means that we need to be honest about it. We need to be bold. We need to think about solutions that match the depth and scope of this problem and that fit with what we know about its causes. Our failure to forcefully advocate for that kind of approach has led us at best to a kind of wheel spinning, to half-baked remedies that don't even come close to matching the need. And predictably what happens then is that that leads to a sense of failure and a kind of passive despair that says, well, we can't really do anything about this problem. It's too big, it's too overwhelming. And trust me, in the absence of good solutions, there is no shortage of bad ones. We see this happening right now. Crime is back on the political agenda in a big way. I'm sure this is true in Alabama as it is where I live in California, mostly not in a good way. In the absence of effective action, the rises in violence over the last couple of years are being blamed on pretty much everything but their actual causes. Again, we see a whole lot of this in California where I live these days. Over the past few years, we've made a number of quite significant and I think very useful, very positive reforms in our criminal justice system in California. A lot of these are designed to get very minor offenders out of our jails and prisons, people like minor drug offenders, minor property offenders, because we know, as much as we know anything in the criminology business, we know that filling our jails and prisons with these folks does nothing to solve the problem of violent crime. And in fact, it takes away resources that we could be using to invest in things that do work. But now we've got plenty of pundits and politicians who are busily telling us that these reforms are the reason why violent crime is going up in our state and across the country. You know, never mind that violent crime is going up in places that did not engage in similar reforms as we've done. Never mind that these reforms haven't actually changed at all the way we treat people who commit violent crimes. It's become a constant political message that's repeated over and over again in the world of political chatter and political campaigns. And it's one that could set our state back a long way. and set the country back a long way and reverse some of the progress that we've made in creating a more humane and more effective justice system. And the same backwards policies, again, are being touted once again all over the country. So I think if we want to provide a better alternative that can compel people's attention, we have to be bold enough and honest enough to tackle the problem. We have to stop shying away from looking hard at the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room in this case is this: that in the midst of one of the world's richest societies with almost unimaginable resources and technological capacity, great numbers of Americans of every race, but Black Americans more than others, still suffer from a toxic mix of adversities that includes extreme poverty, desperately inadequate schools and public services, inaccessible and inferior health care, and an ongoing crisis of joblessness and youth disconnection from school and work that's disturbingly resistant to economic growth in the society as a whole. The communities these folks live in can credibly be described as abandoned, and that's how I describe them in my book. And it's that increasing abandonment, I think, that accounts for the stubborn endurance of violence in many Black communities in the United States. You know, we have an especially striking example of this pattern of abandonment only about 250 miles from you guys in the city of Jackson, Mississippi, which has been in the news a lot lately. It's very far from being the only example of this kind of abandonment. But the situation there has become so desperate that it has caught the attention of the national media, mostly because the city can no longer provide safe water for its residents, or increasingly any water for its residents, because of years of underinvestment in this most basic service. I mean, you can't get much more basic than water. You have a situation where the water pumps are basically falling apart because maintenance has been deferred for decades. And as always, that crisis, I mean, this is a crisis to the point where people are being advised, if they take a shower, not to keep their mouth open in case they ingest some contaminated water, but keep their mouth closed when they shower. That's assuming they have any water to shower at all. This crisis is connected to other things. It's connected, for example, to the fact that Jackson's population is just about 82% Black, 82%. It's connected to the fact that violent death has skyrocketed in Jackson in the last couple of years. It's been pretty high for a long time in that city, but it just went through the roof in the last couple of years. The homicide death rate in Jackson for the population as a whole in that city rose to almost 100 per 100,000 in 2021. Again, that's a very abstract sounding number, but keep in mind, there's no country in the world right now, even the most troubled and volatile and poverty-stricken country, no country in the world has a homicide death rate that high as the death rate in Jackson, Mississippi. So we need to face the reality that these things are connected, and I think they're connected by this notion of abandonment by the larger society. And if we want to turn around this utterly shocking level of violence, we're going to need to attack that reality of social abandonment at its roots. I think the core of that attack, and I talk about this at some length in the book, has to involve public investment in those communities, especially investment that's geared toward providing socially useful and humanly meaningful work. 120 years ago, W.E.B. Du Bois said, and I quote, that the narrow opportunities afforded to Black people for earning a decent living was, as he put it, the center and kernel of the overlapping problems of Philadelphia's Black community, and the issue that white society, he thought, most urgently need to confront. He said, memorably and very forcefully, that for white society to continue to place obstacles in the way of Blacks having a real shot that making a decent living through work was morally wrong, politically dangerous, industrially wasteful, and socially silly. And he said it was the duty of the whites to stop it. Needless to say, that didn't happen. And despite more than a century's worth of research since he wrote those words, confirming Du Bois's insight, it still has not happened. Thankfully, the economy is getting back on its feet after the massive destruction of jobs we suffered during the early days of the pandemic. A lot of people across the country are back at work, but this isn't true for everybody. There's news reports about the situation in Jackson, Mississippi, for example, or in Birmingham in Alabama, stress the same thing. Despite a substantial amount of recovery in the country's job market overall, for Black youth in these most segregated and neglected communities, the opportunities for good, stable work are slim to non-existent. I just read a news report about Jackson, quoting youth in that city as saying, they see nothing in their future, nothing to do, nothing to look forward to. So, to me, and again, I've been studying this stuff for a very long time, and I think that anyone who's paying attention knows that this is a recipe for disaster. The good news is that in the last few years, there have been some strong proposals put on the table to tackle this real world job crisis that remains with us through good times and bad, to tackle this problem head on. There's a group of economists at Duke University, for example, who've come up with a proposal for what they call a job guarantee, which means that if the private economy is unable to provide a job at a decent wage for everybody who's willing to work, the government will step in and create that job. And the idea is that those jobs would kill two birds with one stone. They'd address the crying unmet needs that have crippled our ability to reach our full potential as our society. Crucial work like rebuilding the country's infrastructure, transitioning to an economy based on sustainable energy, providing critical health care, childcare, other social services that are now often in desperately short supply, especially in poor communities, maybe even staffing our water treatment systems, and much more. So if we do this, everybody wins. Not just the jobless people who get good and meaningful jobs, perhaps for the first time in their lives, but also all the rest of us who benefit from the socially necessary work that those people provide. The bad news is that ideas like this have been put on the table before more than once in our history, and they've been shot down every time, shot down by political timidity, by entrenched resistance, and by our peculiar indifference to the lives of those who are ultimately the victims of our failure to invest in our basic public institutions. But here's the thing. I think there's also some really good news, and we need to get the word out about that good news. And the good news is that there have been finally some bold and well-conceived moves at the national level to provide this kind of social investment and to build and train the workforce to carry it out. The American Rescue Act of a couple of years ago, for example, funneled national resources to local communities for job creation, targeted specifically at these communities that have historically suffered the most from systematic uninvestment. The bipartisan infrastructure bill that Congress passed last year promises to pump hundreds of billions of dollars into projects that will tackle some of these critical unmet needs, including, not least, $55 billion to ensure access to safe drinking water for everybody, wherever they live. And in the process, provide a lot of good new jobs. The Inflation Reduction Act that was just signed into law a few weeks ago will likewise provide several hundred more billions of dollars for measures to combat climate change, including investments in renewable energy, that again are going to bring a whole lot of new, very meaningful and very substantial and well-paying jobs that young people in particular can aspire to. There's a couple of other things that we clearly desperately need to do as well. One of them, obviously, is to pass meaningful gun legislation at the national level. This is something we really ought to be able to agree on. 94% of young Black men who died by violence in 2018 died of a gunshot. Since the start of the pandemic, there's been a staggering flood of guns into communities that were already awash in firearms before the pandemic began. And once again, I think we know a good deal about what can work here. We know enough, at any rate, to take meaningful action right now that would make a difference in people's lives, especially in mandating universal background checks at the national level to make sure that guns don't fall so easily into the wrong hands. So there's much more to be said about serious strategies to turn our national affliction of violence around. But the thought I would like to leave you with for now is that we need to raise the level of our game on this enduring crisis. We need to be louder. We need to be unafraid to push for the remedies that we know would make a difference, even if some folks predictably say that they can't be done or that nobody would support them. We have to stand up, I think, and say that it simply cannot be morally or socially tolerable in a country with our resources to allow the levels of needless death and human suffering that these cold numbers I've been throwing out at you represent. We can't allow that suffering to continue year after year, decade after decade, generation after generation. You know, I was struck, and I'll just conclude with some anguished words that I read recently from someone who was mourning the toll that violence had been taking in her community here in West Oakland in California, near where I live. Now, Oakland, by the way, is a city that just suffered 6 homicides in 5 days, a couple of weeks ago. In a letter to city officials, she wrote, "I don't know how many times I have to reiterate that we're in a crisis. We're in a crisis." And she concluded, "We refuse to normalize this. We refuse to normalize this." Well, I think we should all refuse to normalize this. We need to take ownership of this long-standing emergency and to call it what it is. We need to acknowledge that the racial violence divide, like other enduring racial disparities in health and well-being, isn't some kind of natural fact of life. It's not the result of abstract economic or technological forces. It's the result of conscious decisions. Decisions that have systematically impoverished some communities while creating extraordinary privilege and extraordinary wealth in others. And I think that that wealth gives us both the means and the responsibility to undo those decisions and to take significant steps to redress their consequences. Finally, nobody's saying it'll be easy. Nobody's saying it'll be quick. We've certainly got our work cut out for us. The good news, again, is that some people are out there doing that work already. So let's keep it going. Thank you.
Thank you. Between listening to you speak this morning and reading your book, there are so many questions that are coming to mind for me, and I'm sure for people that are joining us. So I just want to tease out some of the threads that you've brought up, and I want to invite others to just jump in if they've got a question. You just said that this isn't a quick fix, and that I would like to hear your thoughts on how you see this being, one, sustainable, and two, maybe some ideas on how long it's going to take, because you mentioned, one of these remedies is a job guarantee. But because these areas that experience the most violence are the most poverty-stricken, have the least amount of resources available to them to start off with, how do we start educating, training, apprenticing? How do we really make an impact for these most stricken communities that are experiencing all of these things which lead to the violence, to really make this sustainable into the future? And what kind of time frame do you see this taking just to get us to a point that's stable? And then we can continue on.
Well, I think it's a very good question. I think the answer is complicated. I think there's two parts of the answer. One is yes, and in a sense, this is a problem that's been brewing for a couple of hundred years. It's not going to turn around. The whole thing is not going to turn around with any immediacy. But I think it's very important to realize that you can start making a difference very, very quickly. Let me give you an example of that. In the book, I talk about a particular program in Chicago, our hometown, that was a very modest program to put poor kids, mostly youth of color, to work in summer jobs, really. This was not a major training program to teach them a particular skill that they would then be able to take out into the rest of the world. That would take a little bit longer. But they provided kids with the opportunity to do something useful over the course of the summer rather than standing around on the street corner. This is in a city where so many people are neither in school nor at work when they are of school age. Huge numbers of youth of color in particular. And the research says that this program worked, that kids who went through this temporary summer job program were much, much less likely to get involved in violence or in crime generally over the course of the next year or so than kids who did not, similar kids who did not participate in that program. So you can make a difference. And this is something I keep seeing over and over again. We think of these problems as being insurmountable, but sometimes you can make an extraordinary difference because the deficits are so huge by doing something small and immediate. It's not enough over the long term, but you can begin to build on that kind of thing. And then, if you think about the amount of resources that we are now beginning for the first time in a really long time to put into things like our infrastructure, we can think about training youth in particular to take on those jobs. We can talk about something that I think is really, really important, which is to involve youth in the decision making about what we're going to do with those funds. What do we need to do in our communities? Get them involved in designing those programs. There are examples of that in our history in the United States. That's going to be the long-term thing, but we can get started right now.
I think that's really interesting that you say getting people involved in the decision making and how those funds will be spent, because I think that this is something that's going to take more than just throwing money at a problem. And it is changing the structure of how we are working with these communities that are, at such deficits. And, I want to kind of go back a little bit before we come back to the remedies and have you talk. You presented so many stark numbers of death and years of potential life loss, but this violence is even more of an issue. It has psychological impacts for people who witness it. They may not experience it directly, but they witness it, they see it around them. This is their daily life, that it's, ubiquitous in their experience, and it really changes how they live their lives. It's a cyclical problem. They can't seem to see a way out. Can you talk about that? I know certainly you mentioned in the book a study in Birmingham that really addresses with young school children. So can you just talk about the pervasiveness of this violence and that it's not always just about, people who are being killed or suffering, physical wounds?
Absolutely, yeah, and I'm very glad you brought that up. When I started working on this book, this is an area that I didn't know as much about as I knew about the rest of what I was talking about. I knew a lot about the violence itself and who was perpetrating it, who the victims were, what some of the remedies might be, but some of the literature, the research on what actually happens, the collateral damage, so to speak, that's done by this violence, particularly to the communities where it is most widespread, was something that I had only scratched the surface of. And the more I got deeply into it, the more I was struck by the reality that, there's almost no area of life and well-being, psychological, physical, communal, that is not affected when a community is suffused by this level of violence. I mean, some of it you can kind of intuit. It wouldn't be terribly surprising that it's going to have consequences for mental health. There's going to be a lot of anxiety. There's going to be a lot of depression. After all, one of the things that happens in communities with high levels of violence is that almost everybody knows somebody who died, sometimes more than one. Again and again, you see these studies which sit down and talk to people who were survivors of the violence that took away their dad or their mom or their brother or their sister, their cousin, maybe two or three of these people at once. So enormous impact that this has, particularly when there's a sense that you can't do anything about it, that you can't make changes. It's just kind of always there. So huge levels of anxiety, huge levels of depression. Sometimes this is met by a kind of desensitization, right? So people kind of shut down so it doesn't bother them so much anymore, right? Other times it simply overwhelms them. But beyond that, there are more complicated things that happen that involve, again, just about every other realm of life. One of the examples that I point to in the book is how violence in a community affects school performance of the kids who live in that community. One study in particular that really struck me showed that, for example, that during the weeks after someone was killed close to the residence of a kid who was about to take some kind of placement exam in the Chicago public schools, those kids performed worse on those exams than kids who were very similar kinds of kids, but there hadn't been a killing, there hadn't been a shooting in their close-in neighborhood just in the past couple of weeks. But that fact of that immediacy and recency of that violence literally, inhibited their school performance. And there's several studies that point to that same kind of thing. So as Jennifer said, this becomes a kind of a cyclical and generational thing. Violence is produced by certain kind of social deficits, but it also helps to produce those social deficits. In this case, it hurts people's school performance, a school achievement. And that then perpetuates a situation in which they start out at a disadvantage. Maybe they drop out of school. Maybe they wind up being out with nothing to do on the street corner. So many, many ramifications of that kind, huge impacts on just about every physical issue that you can think of. It's not just mental health issues, it's issues of physical health as well, violence, increasing problems of high blood pressure, and a number of other kinds of things, all kinds of cardiovascular ills. So yeah, very important to remember that, someone gets shot, there is that terribly tragic event all by itself, but then there are these ripples that go out into the communities, and those ripples are consequential.
Give a moment if anybody else has a question before I take over. But anybody else want to jump in, or I certainly can have some other directions we can take the conversation. Yes.
Hi, my name is Gus. I am very, very glad I came today. I have a degree from a architecture planning school, and my first job out of grad school was to go work for the city of Trenton. I was young, I was idealistic. I said, gee, there's a problem here and we can fix this. And we are called morally to do something about the next person who's not doing very well. With that kind of a background, of course, I was concerned about building things and cleaning things and, water and buildings and lighting and, all of that kind of planning material. I've lived my life around Trenton. I've gone on to do other things, mostly in the finance sector. But I've always had very special relationships with Trenton. And up until very recently, I went back and had a job there working for a nonprofit. the point of all of this is I've seen in these 40 years, I've seen a distinct shift, which I think is very good. It's not enough, but the shift has been a much more holistic approach to dealing with populations that are marginalized, speaking, super broadly, and whether it's, Eskimos or whether it's black folks in Trenton, and now Trenton has a third of the population there is Hispanic, and they basically replaced the community that used to be Italian American, Italian. Some of the finest Italian restaurants, believe it or not, were in Trenton when I was younger, and those folks have simply moved out to the next town, and I live in one of those next towns that borders on Trenton. Um, and it's so healthy to see that they're addressing the health community is finally saying, wait a minute, we got to do more with the buildings. We have to put people in places where they can live, where they've got a job, and the job people are dying to make connections with all of those things. And it's so rich and so complex. The problem is, and the solution is beginning to look, and from my perspective as a traditional planner, so to say, it's looking like progress. It's looking like people are realizing that human beings have many, many, many facets to being whole. And we've got to deal with certainly the majority of them if we're going to get the problem worked out. I think the thing about jobs is brilliant. I don't know. You explained that there was one of the reasons that bill, the jobs approach, um, a phrase that came up while I was in my planning career was the former Senator Moynihan of New York, who said benign neglect was his phrase, and it kind of hit me sideways. I wasn't comfortable with that.
Yeah.
I don't know about the benign part. I mean, I know that there are communities of Americans here in this country who are hateful and who take joy in hurting other people and keeping them down, and they corrupt institutions. I get that, and I don't know. That's between them and whoever. Um, but it's the benign thing. I just know a whole lot of people. I've never known people where you can have a joke about black people in a negative way and use the N word, and that's just not acceptable to everybody I've ever met. And I haven't lived. I've lived in a lot of different places in my life, and my work has taken me to 37 different states. I I don't know, I'm rambling here, but I guess my question would be, how benign do you really think the average Americans are? I think there's an argument to be made. These people are nice people. They have no clue. This is a topic that is not very comfortable, and we all stay away from those, you know, whether it's sex, religion, or money.
Mhm.
Everybody wants to get away from unpleasant topics. So I don't know, what would be your take on this? Just how benevolent are we in from your work?
I think that's a really interesting question. It's really terribly important because ultimately it is people as a whole who are going to make these decisions about whether we do anything about this problem or any
Right.
other of our critical social problems. And I tend to agree with you. I think, and it's interesting to look at the difference in what public opinion surveys tell us about people's views on various social problems versus what we actually do politically about those social problems. Because if you look at these polls, they say again and again, for example, that this idea of a guaranteed job, that's supported by a vast majority of Americans, the American public. They like that idea because we pride ourselves on supporting the idea of work. We want
Work.
people to be out there and be productive
Right.
and earn a living. We've got no problem with that. And yet we haven't been able ever really to get a real federal job guarantee past the political process. So this tells us, I think, that there's a split between that political process and what Americans really want. The same is true of healthcare. You mentioned, you know, I think you're absolutely right. You know, we have to take a holistic view of these things, understand the connection between health issues and job issues and school issues, housing issues, as you say. And people understand that. And people really would like to see a more accessible and effective healthcare system for everybody. That turns up in every public opinion poll I've ever seen, right? Yeah. And yet, you know, it's like pulling teeth, literally, to get anything done on that score. The resistance is fierce. So it has a lot to do, I think, with the political power of some folks, the political powerlessness of others. So to me, at the end of the day, I think the answer to the question of how we make these changes, how we actually make some real progress, has to take place on the political arena broadly conceived, right? Not just what folks do in Washington, but what folks do in terms of mobilizing at the grassroots level and demanding things. And that then puts a big responsibility, I think, on all the rest of us, particularly if we think we know something about these problems. We need to do a much better job, and I include myself and my colleagues in this critique. We need to do a much better job of getting the information out there. I agree with you completely. A lot of folks don't have a clue, not just about this issue, but about so much.
So much.
But once they do, then I think their hearts might just be in the right place.
Yeah.
At least that allows me to sleep better at night.
Yep, me too. Thank you.
You know, it's interesting, Gus, that you bring up planning and, you know, the infrastructure of housing, you know, basic things, basic human rights. But that is absolutely something that's needed, but it's actually something that's needed because of poor decisions made in the past. And one of the factors that led to this crisis is policies that were put in place, such as redlining, such as this disinvestment into certain communities. And that's something that Dr. Currie does talk about in the book too. So yeah, holistically thinking about, you know, going in and into these really poor communities, the ones that have been marginalized for so long, and having that investment in every level, from the social care, healthcare, schools, buildings, you know, housing, all of that is so important. And that goes hand in hand, I think, with some of the remedies that Dr. Currie is proposing of this, you know, job guarantee, looking also at a legislature that you know, have gun restrictions. I know, Dr. Currie, you've talked a little bit about reparations. So pulling from all of the bad policy decisions made into the past to correcting them today, I want to come to one key question that Dr. Currie and I talked about is how this can be paid for.
How it can be paid for. You know, it's a very good question. Some people get impatient with that kind of question because they say, well, you know, we pay for stuff all the time and nobody ever concerns about it. We pay billions and billions for the military budget. Nobody complains about it. This is true, but I think the question is a good one. We have to know where the resources are going to come from, if we have them or not. And I think there's several parts to the answer, but I think absolutely there's no question that we can pay for these things. The most important piece of the answer is that it costs us immeasurable amounts of money to continue the status quo, as opposed to changing it. So what it costs us to keep young people idle, for example, to keep them not working, and to keep them doing all kinds of stuff that's socially and economically destructive, that is hugely expensive. The cost of violence itself, the medical costs, the law enforcement costs, the costs and lost productivity of people who die, of people who go to prison, those costs themselves are enormous. And when you calculate over time, over generations, the amount of social resources that we simply squander, that we simply waste on maintaining the inequalities that we have and the social deficits that we have. You know, I sometimes in my classes, I compare the country as a whole to sort of like a homeowner who knows that there's a leak in a pipe in the basement, but they don't want to shell out the money to fix it because it costs too much, right? Well, what happens then is that the basement floods, the house falls down, you spend vastly more money as a result of failing to deal in a responsible way, with that problem in the first place. That's one of the biggest pieces of the issue. The other thing is, if you look at the kinds of remedies that I think are the most important, particularly this idea of public social investment into communities that have been neglected, investment that does provide jobs for people, you increase the country's wealth, because this investment is going to go to productive activities. I mean, if you go back again to what I think is this horrifically shocking thing in Jackson, Mississippi, where they have no water, you know, this is costing over the long run that city and the state of Mississippi a huge amount of money because of the damage it does to people's health and to people's productivity, right? Just go in there, fix this thing, get the community back on its feet. And we can think the same thing with education, for example, with doing something about the urban school systems where we have school buildings that are literally falling down and are overrun with rats, where we make sure that every kid has a shot at a decent education, where we maybe have things like school nurses and counselors, adults in the room, you know, who can help those kids become productive. Every time we seriously invest in remedying those deficits, we increase the country's productivity. And every study that I've ever seen that's honest shows that you make money when you do that, right? You make money. It's not money that you're pounding down a rat hole. This is money that, just like the money you salt away for your own kids' education or to buy yourself a home, this is money that grows over time. So for those two reasons in particular, I think we would have no problem paying for these things. We found, it was interesting, you know, the American Rescue Act that came into effect in the early days of the pandemic, which I mentioned, we put out, you know, close to $2 trillion into the economy to keep things afloat. If we had not done that, I shudder to think of what would have happened in terms of the increases in poverty and the economic, you know, sheer economic slowdown and stagnation that would have happened in the early pandemic. We found the money, and that's, you know, where I come from. $2 trillion is hardly chump change. You know, we found the money, and nobody, you know, nobody even blinked an eye that we spent it. So it's there. It's there. We just need to get past that entrenched political resistance to spinning it in constructive ways.
Well, we have gone over our hour. This has been a fascinating discussion. I will just, before we close, if anybody has any last minute thoughts, feel free to jump in.
I've got one.
Okay.
Hi, it's Angie, the director here at the museum, and thank you for this. I can't imagine a better investment of my time on this Saturday morning than really hearing everybody's perspectives on this matter. And you know, just as you mentioned Jackson a number of times this morning, it's, you know, they are a sister city to us in a way, with an art museum that is very similar to ours, and we have a relationship with them for that reason. And so I've been sort of hearing all this through the lens of, you know, Gus said this is going to take a holistic approach to really remedy the situation. And Dr. Currie, you've talked about sort of the the macro remedies, and we definitely fall into kind of the micro remedies band. But I really like what's happened. This is more of a statement than anything else, but I appreciate that, you know, once and for all, our industry, the cultural arts sector, has really started to stand up and ask questions about what is ours to do in all of this. And, you know, I've been texting with my equivalent at the Mississippi Museum of Art in Jackson this week, just saying, how you doing? What's up? And she says, you know, it's so interesting. It's just, you know, what is ours to do? Are we a place of solace? Are we a place of stimulation where we, you know, they, like we, do exhibitions like this and host programs like this to put, to get information out and to cause people to move in the direction of, you know, meaningful action. And she's such a deeply compassionate and empathetic leader that she says, yeah, there's all of that, but when do you just say, everybody put your pencils down and go down to the food bank and go get some pallets of water and just use your work time today to, you know, literally, you know, work in service to the community in a much more direct way. And you know, I saw some of that happen here during the pandemic, when there were just moments when we're like, well, this isn't necessarily an art museums to do today, but if you have access to masks, let's use the pipeline that is the museum to, you know, do what we can do, even if it doesn't feel like at face value that you're, you know, directly plugging into mission. So, you know, we have people here who represent a lot of different communities, and there are the traditional places that we've always looked to solve our problems, but this is going to take us all. And so I think to keep open eyes to other institutions and structures within communities that have shifted gears and see it as our responsibility to do for and with and by in whatever way makes sense at any point in time. You know, sometimes it is just putting up an exhibition or having a program, but then sometimes it's having enough compassion and empathy just to do whatever needs doing, no matter what it is.
Yeah, I think you put that really well, and I think that's eloquently stated. You know, we in the academic business, I think, have the same set of issues in a way. How do we best confront real world issues? And we struggle with it, you know, trying to figure out the balance. I'm trying to figure it out right now in terms of, you know, involvement in grassroots organizing of one kind or another versus writing stuff versus teaching stuff. But I guess I agree with what I think you were saying, which is that the best approach is to do all of the above if you possibly can. It could be a place of solace, it can be a place of information and education, which I think is a role that's just a marvelous one that your organization in Montgomery has played, and others around the country. And also, as you say, you can roll up your sleeves and go down and carry those bottles of water if you have to. It really can be confusing, and it sort of confounds our sense that we have one thing that we're supposed to do, or that we're trained to do, or that our organization does. But in fact, under the conditions we're living in now, I think you're absolutely right. We do as much of whatever we can, and try to get enough rest and good nutrition.
My name is Nancy, and I live in Montgomery, and this is the first time I've been to one of these programs. Thank you so much. It is absolutely stunning to hear your the results of your research, Doctor. Since I've been listening to you here, I have been on the verge of tears the whole time, you know, and I feel a sense of relief, like I'm not the only one, you know, who has been seeing, you know, these deficits in our communities. And it doesn't matter if you're living in Montgomery, Alabama, or if you're living in San Diego, where I used to live, I mean, it's a universal thing here.
Yeah.
It's tragically real. And when you were talking about, youth work programs, when I was in high school in the 60s, and I don't know if this was part of, the Great Society initiative or quite what, but they had a program that was called the Neighborhood Youth Corps.
Yeah.
And I was from a lower economic family, I mean, things were very rough for all kinds of reasons. And my mother, suggested that if I wanted to have a certain kind of purse or shoes or something, that I should look into this program. And I participated in that for the whole 3 years of my high school. They paid, I think it was either minimum wage or just a little bit less. And I did all kinds of, odd jobs around the school for the attendance people or whatever. And it was really, when you mentioned, youth programs, that is immediately what I thought of. And the difference that it made in my life, to have like maybe $3, at that time.
Yeah.
Was absolutely huge. It was huge. And it also, not only did it work during the school year, but it also provided work during the summertime, which was also fantastic, because kids get bored.
Yes.
We just get bored. That's, I think that's probably just a fact of childhood. So, I would be happy to see, similar programs come back. I mean, because there's all kinds of stuff that needs to be done. And I actually learned how to work. And that, if I was given a task, then I did it the way that they wanted to have it done, not the way that I thought I should go. So there was a whole slew of different things that happened. The other thing, since I have been here, I'm curious to know if the effect of migration or the effect of migration on some parts of the country. When I went to Selma for the first time, I was frankly, I was shocked. I for such an iconic place, it is in, considerable disrepair. I think there's some private public partnership things that are going on. Some artists have come in and, a couple of other things. But I wonder if, during the 60s, at the height of, migration of the population away from the South and into different cities, has had a dual impact, not only just southern cities, but now northern cities as well.
Well, thank you for those comments. I'm especially happy that you shared your experience with the Neighborhood Youth Corps. I mean, I basically love those programs for all the reasons that you spoke about. They provide a sense of purpose. They get people to doing stuff that's socially useful, get them off the street, and as you say, teach people to work, which is really an important thing. Teach people how how good it feels to do a job and do it the right way. We started that kind of program big time back in the Great Depression to the 30s. And it's kind of an unfortunately kind of a little known aspect of our national history, but some of those programs were just astonishing. And I'm sure, in San Diego or in Trenton or in Montgomery, you have examples of things that were built during the Great Depression by some of these work programs. And in Berkeley, California, where I live, there's a park, beautiful rose garden park right around the corner from where I live. It was built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s, right, which was a very similar type of program. So I think, and again, this is why I'm so excited that we've now got some legislation that is going to put money into public investment and create some public jobs, because I think that involving youth in that kind of thing is going to be the biggest single thing that we can do on the violence problem specifically, and a number of other things as well. Beyond it, it's not just to tamp down violence, but it's to give a larger sense of opportunity and purpose and meaning, which I think is just absolutely crucial. And it's something that everybody deserves to have. So I'm really glad that you shared that story. About the migration, I mean, I think there's a couple of things. One of the migrations, of course, that has been really important in terms of violence is the more local migration, frankly, of white people out of cities, particularly in the South, but not wholly in the South. This has happened in my town of Chicago as well. But what that's done, one of the reasons why Jackson, Mississippi's population is 82% Black, it wasn't always 82% Black, but an awful lot of white folks moved out of town. Some of them moved farther away, but a lot of them moved into the surrounding areas, which became pretty much all white. And it's a phenomenon that we all know about. What that's meant, combined with our unfortunate history of systemic racism, that's meant that a place that is so heavily Black is going to be shafted when it comes to the investment of resources. And that's happened in many cities across the country, as I say. You know, I was actually born in a place that's only about a 3 hours drive, I think, from Montgomery. I was born in Macon, Georgia. And you can see very, very similar things happening there. The city has changed very much from the time when I used to go and see my grandmother, you know, when she was alive in that city. The city has changed very much, and it's shocking to see the disrepair, you know, as you say, that city has fallen into. Something that I would like to go there sometime and see if I can help out with it. But again, it has to do with the migration out of the people who have political influence, who can say, hey, there's potholes in the street. I drove down one street near where my grandmother used to live in Macon, and my car was nearly swallowed up by a hole in the road. You know, this would not have happened in my grandmother's Macon. So that kind of migration, I think in particular, wholly based on racial prejudice and discrimination, has a lot to do with the problems we're talking about.
Thank you.
Well, this has been a really wonderful discussion and provided us with a lot to chew on and think about. And also, I think, you know, giving us this charge to make a difference and to figure out ways that we can, I'm sorry, what was that? Meaningful action, as Angie has just said. Absolutely. So I want to thank you all for joining us this morning. If you haven't read Dr. Currie's book, I hope this has inspired you to. It is a fascinating read. For those of you who are not in the Alabama area, I invite you to come and visit us at any time here at the Montgomery Museum of Fine Arts. Certainly, if you are here in Alabama, we hope that you can come soon and see this exhibition, A Site of Struggle, American Art Against Anti-Black Violence. But again, we really appreciate your taking time on this Saturday morning to join us in this really, really deeply thoughtful conversation. So thank you all. And thank you, Dr. Currie.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me in, and keep up the good work. It's inspiring.
Right back at you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.
I have to do that first.